That's right. All right.
Sind wir live? Wunderbar.
Live. Well, that was great. See you guys.
Yeah, the reading is almost over. No, just kidding. Herzlich willkommen, schönen guten Abend hier bei Lovely Books zur Livestream-Lesung mit dem kanadischen Autor, Blogger und Aktivisten Cory Doctorow. Wir haben eine große Audience hier schon im Raum und sicherlich auch viele Leute, die den Livestream eingeschaltet haben. Wir wollen heute Abend reden über Corys neues Buch For the Win. Wir werden diese Lesung auf Englisch machen. Ihr könnt eure Fragen aber natürlich gerne auch auf Deutsch stellen und dann übersetze ich. Ich sehe hier die ersten Kommentare auf der Twitter-Wall laufen schon ein. Und wir werden aber einen Teil des Buches auch auf Deutsch hören. Es gibt eine Lesung mit einem Teil auf Deutsch gelesen und einem Teil von Cory auf Englisch gelesen. So Cory, welcome. Good evening. Great that you are here. So For the Win is your second young adult novel after Little Brother, Kleiner Bruder, which came out in 2008 and which was very much about surveillance and sort of the state of perpetual crisis and terrorism. And now we're again in a future which is unspecified in the near future, but it's also very close to what we see today. And the overall topic is gaming. Games have gained even more prominence than today. So maybe you can introduce us a little bit why you wanted to write about gaming and what your specific interest in that topic is.
Well, so, I mean, like everybody else kind of who was born after 1970, I'm a gamer. But, you know, at least to the extent that I've played more games than pretty much anyone born before 1970 played in their whole life. So that's without even trying. I was never... I thought I was kind of a moderately avid gamer, and then I met my wife, who was a professional Quake player on the English team, and I realized that I was a rank amateur. And so living with my wife put me into contact with enormous amounts of games and game developers, because she's a game producer and developer. She was working in public broadcasting in the UK at the time. About maybe 8-9 years ago, I read a short story or an article linked from Slashdot that was about a guy who'd given a presentation at the Game Developers Conference, claiming that he was paying people in Mexico to play this game called EverQuest, and he was selling the characters and the weapons and the gold that they got to Americans. And it made a big stir, not least because no one was sure if he was telling the truth. He kind of had a reputation for stretching the truth. But I thought it would make a really good story. So I wrote a short story called Anda's Game. And the story was very well received. It got translated into a lot of languages. It was turned into a comic and so on. And it was, for many people, the first time they encountered the idea of what was to become gold farming, this practice of paying people in a poor country to play a game so that the virtual wealth could be sold to people in rich countries. And because they read it first in my story, they assumed that I thought it up. And so every time there was any kind of story about gold farming anywhere in the world's media, I immediately got 100 copies of it in my inbox with, oh my God, your prediction has come true. As a result, I became kind of an instant low-grade expert on gold farming without ever even trying. And that meant that the subject was one of the things kind of floating around in my head as I thought about what would and wouldn't make a good story. And you know, eventually enough pieces all came together, and I found myself writing For the Win. I say that a novel is more like an avalanche than a car crash, in that a car crash usually has a kind of really immediate set of causes. You can kind of tell why there was a car crash. You know, that guy was trying to light a cigarette while changing the CD, and he lost control of his car, and there was a car crash. But avalanches are the kind of thing where there's a lot of tiny, minute causes that have no immediate effect. You know, this little bit of gravel falls and this little bit of gravel falls, and they build up, and they're just ready, waiting for one more piece of gravel to fall on them, whereupon the avalanche begins. And novels are for me, an accretion of lots of different little ideas, lots of encounters with games, gamers, game economies, and so on. And one day I kind of woke up and said, oh, there's a novel in this, and started working on it.
Good. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the setting of the novel. I mean, in these online games, people from all over the world can connect and play together. So you have a bunch of characters, some in India, some in China, some in the US, mostly teenagers who do this gold farming and who also encounter various pressures. They have to work for their bosses and work long shifts and stuff. So how do you tie this together in the novel?
Well, sure. I mean, in some ways, this is a book about how global all online culture and ultimately youth culture has become. Mimi Ito, who's the sociologist in California who wrote the Digital Youth Project, which is the largest project ever done on studying the way young Americans use networks. One of the things she talks about is just how global teenagers have become, how easy it is for people in different countries to talk to each other, to sample each other's culture. So this is a book about a trade union movement called the Industrial Workers of the World Wide Web, or Weblies, which is kind of an in-joke for people who know their labor history. There was a famous anarchist union called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. And the headquarters, such as they are this gang of 3 people in Singapore who reach out to gamers all over the world who are engaged in gold farming and say, don't you think that you should and could get a better deal out of your boss? And so they visit them in the games and invite them to do this. And they find many people who are sympathetic to their cause, and they find themselves kind of in a position where they're starting to have a little bit of muscle and able to start shifting working conditions, whether those are in the Mumbai slum of Dharavi, which is the largest slum in the East. The only larger slum in the world is in Brazil, or whether that's in the Pearl River Delta in China, which is the place where 80 million young women have gone since the World Trade Organization agreement to staff the factory complexes there. Pretty much everything in this room and almost everything we own was made by one of those 80 million women. It was the largest migration in human history, and it's an amazing and bizarre place, the Pearl River Delta, or in the provinces of China that have been depopulated, or in Vietnam and Eastern Europe and all the other places where gold farming is taking place. And the response from the people who run the gold farms is first to go to the internet cafes where the union organizers are and try to convince them by various means, including chains and belts and so on, that they should stop. But also where they can't find the internet cafes, they can always just pay other kids to go to the worlds where the union organizing is taking place as orcs or spaceship pilots or people running giant mechas armed with enormous Baroque weaponry and just sort of shoot the characters of the people who are organizing the unions. And so it's a book about these kind of battles that are waged both with words and with virtual bullets and with real blood and with sort of organizational acumen in all these different places.
So you have a strong sort of action plot that drives forth this story with all the political underpinnings, and strikes break out, and the union of the Weblies gets into a deep fight with the game authorities, so to speak, as well as the real authorities and the gold farmers. And the scene you want to read tonight is sort of one of the triggers of this strike. And maybe you can give a few sentences of context for this, and then I switch places with the Munich actor Alexander Meile, who will start reading the scene in German, and then you take over and finish it in English.
I'll open it up so I can read it as well. So the scene that we're going to read tonight is kind of self-contained little short story in the middle of the book, and it's an account of the event that sets off the Wildcat strike that really sets the action in motion, kind of halfway through the book, where everything starts to really kick off. All the people from all over the world end up converged in this one big battle that occupies the rest of the book. And it starts with an internet cafe in Shenzhen in the Pearl River Delta, and a place where young people work. So we can start now.
Es war stickig in dem Café. An solchen Orten war es immer stickig. Doch die Hitze der letzten Wochen hatte die Temperaturen in solch astronomische Höhen getrieben, dass das Café jetzt wie der Krater eines magenkranken Vulkans vor sich hinschwelte. Der Besitzer, ein alter Mann mit Narben im Gesicht, dessen Verbindung zu ein paar schweren Jungs kein Geheimnis war, hatte einen Techniker die Gehäuse bei allen Rechnern mit einem Schraubenzieher entfernen lassen. Die Hitze konnte auf diese Weise ungehindert entweichen, von den glühenden Motherboards wie von den überdimensionierten Grafikkarten, die vor zusätzlichen Lüftern und glänzenden, kupfernen Kühlkörpern nur so starrten. Als nächstes installierte der Techniker riesige Bodenventilatoren. Für die Computer mochte das ja toll sein, das Café aber wurde dadurch nur noch heißer und war fortan von einem derart lauten Düsendonnern erfüllt, dass die Spieler nicht mal mehr Headsets mit Rauschunterdrückung verwenden konnten. Sie mussten sich für ihre Kommunikation mit Text begnügen. Einst waren die Stammkunden dieses Internetcafés ganz andere gewesen. Spieler aus der Gegend, ein paar liebeskranke Arbeitermädchen, die die ganze Nacht mit ihren virtuellen Freunden chatteten, Arbeiter mit Heimweh, die Lügen über ihr wundervolles Leben in Südchina an die Daheimgebliebenen schickten und gelegentlich auch ein Tourist, der sich verlaufen hatte und online nach seinen Freunden oder einem billigen Hotel Ausschau halten wollte. Doch in den letzten 2 Jahren hatte das Café einen stetig wachsenden Kader von Goldfarmern beherbergt. Ihre Bosse leiteten ein Dutzend verschiedene Unternehmen, die alle miteinander verquickt waren und ständig ihr Gesicht veränderten, sodass die Bosse jedes Mal, wenn es nach Ärger roch, den jeweiligen Laden über Nacht einfach dicht machten und sich wie Flaschengeister in Luft auflösen konnten. Keiner der Jungs im Café war älter als 17. Alle Älteren waren letzten Monat entlassen worden, weil sie nach einer 22-stündigen Sonderschicht eine Pause verlangt hatten. Diese Störenfriede loszuwerden war für die Bosse aus zweierlei Gründen gut. Zum einen konnten sie die Aufwiegler durch billigere Arbeiter ersetzen, zum anderen brauchten sie ihnen die 22-Stunden-Schicht nicht mehr zu bezahlen. Es gab immer Jungen, die ihren Lebensunterhalt durch Spielen finanzieren wollten. Und diese Spieler, die hatten es wirklich drauf. Nach 12 Stunden Arbeit hängten sie gern noch einen langen Raid zum Spaß dran. Das Café war wie ein großer Kessel, in dem die Jungen, die Hitze, der Lärm, die Snacks und das Netzwerk zu einem niemals versiegenden Eintopf des Reichtums verkocht wurden, an dem sich eine Handvoll, meist unsichtbarer, älterer Herren gütlich tat. Rui Ling wusste, dass hier früher ein paar andere gearbeitet hatten, ältere Jungen, die die eine oder andere Meinungsverschiedenheit mit den Bossen gehabt hatten. Er dachte nicht sonderlich oft an sie, doch wenn er es tat, stellte er sich meist ein paar gierige Trottel vor, die zu faul waren, für ihr Geld arbeiten zu gehen. Loser, die er am liebsten mit einem kräftigen Tritt in den Hintern zurück nach Sichuan geschickt hätte oder von wo auch immer sie sich ins Perlflussdelta gestohlen hatten. Rui Ling war ein verdammt guter Spieler. Am besten war er im Player versus Player, denn er hatte es einfach drauf, sich innerhalb weniger Momente ein fast komplettes Bild von den Eigenheiten und Schwächen eines anderen Spielers zu machen. Er konnte es nicht erklären, das Wissen traf ihn einfach wie ein Pfeil ins Auge. Im Ergebnis konnte niemand einen Charakter schneller hochspielen als Rui Ling. Er wanderte einfach mit einem chinesischen Namen durchs Spiel und quatschte alle, die er traf, auf Chinesisch an. Früher oder später fühlte sich irgendein reicher, fetter, dummer Westler zum Ordnungshüter berufen, riskierte eine dicke Lippe und forderte ihn zum Duell heraus. Das nahm er an, trat ihm in den Hintern und hatte wieder ein paar Punkte beisammen. Es war erstaunlich, wie viel Spaß das machte. Rui Ling hatte gerade 12 Stunden davon hinter sich. Er hatte sich eine Portion Teigtaschen mit Fleischfüllung bestellt und tunkte sie mit den Stäbchen in eine feuerrote vietnamesische Soße. Während er sie verschlang, freute er sich noch auf ein wenig Spiel zum Runterkommen. Dafür nahm er immer seinen eigenen Chair, den er schon seit früher Kindheit spielte. Irgendwie war dieser Charakter ein Teil von ihm, so lange hatte er ihn jetzt schon. Er hatte ihn hochgespielt, soweit es ging, ausgereizt und mit der besten und seltensten Ausrüstung versehen. Unzählige Toons hatte er aufgepäppelt und verkauft. Rui Ling aber gehörte ihm. Heute Abend tat er sich mit ein paar anderen Farmern zusammen, von denen er manche noch von daheim kannte. Andere hatte er noch nie getroffen. Sie waren eine wilde Gilde, die immer nachts unterwegs war und die schwersten Missionen spielte, die es gab. Die Crème de la Crème. Das hatte sich herumgesprochen, und deshalb hatten sie jetzt auch immer ein paar Zuschauer dabei, die ehrfürchtig verfolgten, wie er die Gegner reihenweise platt machte. Er genoss das und beantwortete hinterher auch gern ihre Fragen, sodass alle was davon hatten. Sie liebten ihn und das war das Beste daran. Heute drangen sie in Buris Festung ein, den Palast des lange verschollenen Stammvaters der Götter. Er war die Urkraft, die Svartalfheim und das ganze Universum in die Existenz gerufen hatte. Der Palast hatte furchterregende Wächter, war nur mit Hilfe mächtiger Zaubersprüche zu betreten und in der ganzen Geschichte von Svartalfheim Warriors noch nie komplett durchgespielt worden. Genau die Art Mission, die Rui Ling reizte. Es war sein 6. Anlauf und er war bereit, 6 Stunden am Stück zu spielen, wenn es sein musste, genau wie der Rest seiner Gilde. Und dann bekam er den Fenriszahn. Das war das seltenste und legendärste Item im ganzen Spiel. Ein mächtiger Talisman, mit dem man jedes Wolfsrudel auf seine Seite ziehen konnte. In den Foren gab es haufenweise Gerüchte darüber und ein paar Mal hatten Betrüger behauptet, den Zahn zu besitzen und sich an krummen Geschäften damit versucht, aber niemand hatte ihn wirklich je gesehen. Rui Ling hatte gerade eine epische Schlacht gegen eine Armee von Himmelsriesen geschlagen, in der alle außer ihm getötet worden waren, und einen Moment lang verschlug es ihm die Sprache. Er zeigte nur auf den Bildschirm, während sein Mund sich öffnete und schloss. Auch die anderen Spieler waren verstummt, folgten seinem Blick und begannen langsam zu begreifen, was gerade passiert war. Ein Murmeln breitete sich aus und nahm an Fahrt auf, wurde immer lauter, steigerte sich zu einem Donnern, einem Siegesgeheul, das das ganze Café herbeirief. Der Jubel übertönte sogar die Lüfter. Eine hormongetränkte Stammesübung im triumphalen Auf die Brust schlagen, die sie alle hinwegriss. Jeder von ihnen hatte schon davon geträumt, wie es wohl wäre, mit dem Fenriszahn raiden zu gehen, jeden Widerstand mit einem einfachen Mausklick zu brechen, jedem Gegner die Wolfsrudel auf den Hals hetzen zu können. Ihnen allen schlug das Herz bis zum Hals. Doch dann war da ein anderer Laut, der immer bestimmter wurde. Eine ältere, harte Stimme, kratzig von 1 Million Zigaretten. Hinsetzen! Hinsetzen! Zurück an die Arbeit! Alle zurück an die Arbeit! Das war die Stimme von Huang, dem Aufseher. Er kam aus Fujian und sprach einen furchterregenden Dialekt. Angeblich war er mal ein Snakehead gewesen, ein Menschenschmuggler, den man aus der Gang geworfen hatte, weil durch seine Behandlung einfach zu viele Migranten gestorben waren. Normalerweise saß er reglos wie eine Echse in der Ecke und rauchte eine falsche Marlboro nach der anderen. Die Zigaretten waren billige chinesische Imitate, filterlos, stark, und die Rauchfahne, die ihm stets ins Gesicht stieg, ließ ihn ständig eines seiner Augen zusammenkneifen. Manchmal vergaßen die Spieler, dass er überhaupt da war, doch wenn die Unruhe im Café zu groß wurde, schlich er sich katzenhaft von hinten an sie an und schlug ihnen so hart aufs Ohr, dass ihnen der Kopf herumflog. Diese Lektion blieb ihnen meistens im Gedächtnis und musste selten wiederholt werden. Jetzt aber teilte er Schläge links und rechts aus und bellte mit seiner heiseren Stimme Befehle. Hastig stolperten die Jungen auf ihre Plätze zurück. Rui Ling saß wieder allein vor seinem Rechner, ein unsicheres Lächeln auf dem Gesicht.
"Boss," he said, "you see what I've done?" He pointed at his screen. Wang's face was as impassive as ever. He put a hard, heavy hand on Riling's shoulder and leaned in to read the screen, his head wreathed in smoke. Finally he straightened. "Fenrir's tooth," he said. He nodded. "A bonus for you, Riling. Very good." Wang turned to look. Riling shrank back. "Boss," he said, respectfully, speaking loudly to be heard over the computer fans. "Boss, that's my character. I'm not working now. It's my personal character." Wang turned to look at him, his eyes hard, his expression flat. "A bonus," he said again. "Well done." "It's my character," Riling said, speaking more loudly. "No bonus. It's mine. I earned it personally in my own time." He didn't even see the blow, it was that fast. 1 minute he was hotly declaring that Fenrir's tooth was his. The next he was sprawled on his ass on the floor, his head ringing like a gong. The foreman put 1 foot on his throat. The man said, "No bonus," clearly and distinctly, so that everyone around could hear. Then he hawked up a huge mouthful of poisonous green spit from the tar-soaked depths of his blackened lungs, and he carefully spat it in Ruling's face. From the age of 4, Ruling had practiced wushu, training with a man in the village whom all the adults deferred to. The man had been sent north during the Cultural Revolution, denounced and beaten and starved, but he'd never broken. He was as gentle and patient as a grandmother. He was as old as the hills, and he could send an attacker flying through the air with the flick of a wrist, break a board with his old hands, kick you into the next life with one old, gnarled foot. For 12 years, Ruling had gone 3 times a week to train with the old man. All the boys had. It was just part of life in the village. He hadn't practiced since he'd come to South China, had all but forgotten that relic of a forgotten land. But now he remembered every lesson, remembered them deep in his bones and his muscles. He gripped the ankle of the foot that was on his throat, twisted just slightly to gain maximum leverage, and applied a small, controlled bit of pressure and threw the foreman into the air, sending him sailing in a perfect, graceful arc that terminated when his head cracked against the side of one of the long trestle tables, knocking it over and sending a dozen flat screens tumbling to the ground, the crash audible over the noise of the computer fans. Ruling stood carefully and faced the foreman. The man was groaning on the ground, and Ruling couldn't keep a small grin off his face. That had felt good. He found that he was standing in the ready stance, weight balanced evenly on each foot, feet spread for stability, body side on to the man on the ground, presenting a smaller target. His hands were loosely held up, one before the other, ready to catch a punch and lock the arm and throw the attacker, ready to counterstrike high or low. The boys around him were cheering, chanting his name, and Ruling smiled more broadly. The foreman picked himself up off the floor, no expression at all on his face, a terrible blankness, and Ruling felt the first inkling of fear. Something about how the man held himself as he stood, not anything like the stance in the martial arts games he'd played in the village. This was something altogether more serious. Ruling heard a high, whining noise and realized it was coming from his own throat. He lowered his hand slightly, extended one in a friendly palm-up way. "Come on now," he said. "Let's be adults about this." And that's when the foreman reached under the shoulder of his ill-fitting, rumpled, dander-speckled suit jacket and pulled out a small, cheap pistol, pointed it at Ruling, and shot him square in the forehead. Even before Ruling hit the floor, one eye open, the other shut, the boys around him began to roar. The foreman had 1 second to register the sound of 100 voices rising in anger before the boys boiled over, clambering over one another to reach him. Too late, he tried to tighten his finger on the trigger of the gun he carried ever since leaving behind Fujian province all those years before. By then, 3 boys had fastened themselves to his arm and forced it down so that the gun was aiming into the meat of his old thigh, and the .22 slug he squeezed off drilled itself into the big femur before flattening on the shattered bone, spreading out like a lead coin. When he opened his mouth to scream, fingers found their way into his cheeks, viciously tearing at them even as other hands twined themselves in his hair, fastened themselves to his feet and arms, even yanked at his ears. Someone punched him hard in the balls twice, and he couldn't breathe around the hands in his mouth, couldn't scream as he tumbled down. The gun was wrenched from his hand at the same instant that 2 fists drilled into his eyes, and then it was dark and painful and infinite, a moment that stretched off into his unconsciousness and then into annihilation. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. One thing I forgot to mention in the beginning, the very nice people here at Lovely Books give away 5 signed copies of For the Win. I have no idea how they're going to decide who gets one, but I guess asking or posting a question on the Twitter wall, on the Facebook wall, could help. because we mostly now want to take your questions out there and in the room, and a couple already came in. So I start with Sarah Gottwald, who asks on Facebook, I'd like to know how you get the idea to write books about gaming, the internet, and all that stuff, and not only blogging about it.
Gosh, I mean, it's really hard to say. I guess, when you assemble or accumulate all these bits and pieces about games and networks and what's happening in the wider world, somehow a kind of aesthetic effect occurs to you that's inspired by them, and a thing that has an interesting, crunchy, textured feeling, and you want to figure out how to put that feeling into other people's heads, which is kind of what art is about. It's having a feeling in your head and trying to put it in someone else's head using some medium. And so you start to figure out how you might assemble all those ideas, all those crumbs, into a book that might put that feeling into someone else's head.
I think maybe you should open your laptop again, because Bookstopia on Twitter is wondering what are all these stickers on your laptop.
The story is that it started. I was at a meeting in New York that everyone had white iBooks at. And at lunch, we put our lids down and went off to lunch. And someone thought it would be funny to move them around at the lunch break. And what he didn't reckon on was that one of the attendees was going home to Seattle right after lunch. So he walked into the room, grabbed his laptop, put it in his bag, and got on a plane to Seattle. And after that, I wanted to be sure that I would never mistake my laptop for anyone else's. So I have yet to mistake my laptop for anyone else's since I embarked on this stickering project of mine. I go through about a laptop a year, so I have lots of stickers for the next one and the one after that. When I gave up smoking, my doctor said, well, why do you want to quit? What are you going to think about when you wake up with a craving tomorrow night that'll keep you from going out and getting a pack of cigarettes? And I said, well, I don't want to get cancer. And he said, yes, but you're not going to get cancer for 40 more years, and that's not going to help you tomorrow. You need an immediate reason. And I said, well, I do spend 2 laptops a year on cigarettes. And he said, there you go. So I buy a laptop every year with my cigarette money.
Great. Another one from Facebook, Petra Samani. I enjoyed your reading yesterday at Shadow Gymnasium in Berlin. That's where we were yesterday morning, reading in front of 400 high school kids. And just finished reading your book. Do you think it would be possible in real life to organize workers all over the world like that? Could change the world?
Yeah, well, I think that, what's happened over the last 20 years is information technology has made it possible to manage these very long supply chains, and that's made it possible for capital, for people who run factories and concerns, to move their industry over and over again to any place where the labor is cheap and unorganized. Labor, by contrast, hasn't had access to the information technology that would allow them to kind of keep up. Because information technology was expensive, it came to capital first. But information technology keeps on getting cheaper. And so one of the things that we know is that when information technology becomes cheaper, its benefits go to larger and larger pools of people. And I think it would be more remarkable if labor was the only organization in the world that didn't use information technology to advance its cause than if they found themselves using it.
A couple of questions.
Should we take any questions from the room as well?
I mean, of course.
Put your hand up if you have a question. Otherwise, we're just going to.
Question. Otherwise, I just go on with
from the invisible
Twitter
people.
Questions.
Yeah,
please.
Are your German books also licensed under Creative Commons?
Some of them have been. I'll repeat it for the people who can't hear it here. The question is, are my books CC licensed in Germany? Some of them have been. As I understand it, there's a greater degree of logistical intensity in clearing the rights for Creative Commons in Germany because you have to sort it out with the translator and the translator's agent as well as clearing it with the publisher. So I think Heine said that they don't have a disagreement in principle with it, so I would hope that it would emerge, but I can't promise anything in the case of the Heine editions. They've done it with my earlier editions, though, the German editions of Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom and Eastern Standard Tribe, which were called Upload and Backup. Or backup and upload. Yeah.
But if somebody translated it as a fan from the English...
Yeah, that's absolutely possible, yeah. Because it's CC licensed in English, it allows for derivatives. I'm actually, after talking it over with my foreign rights agent, for the next one, Pirate Cinema, what it's going to say is Creative Commons no derivatives. Derivatives other than translations are allowed without permission. Please ask me if you're making a translation, only because my foreign rights agent has said, look, I keep going to your foreign publishers and they don't understand this Creative Commons stuff, and I would much rather have the conversation that goes, fans are so interested they'd like to Creative Commons license it, let's figure out how to make that part of the strategy for releasing the book, than have the conversation that goes, what the hell has just happened, what is this Creative Commons thing, we thought we'd bought the rights from you. And so, not out of a desire to hold back CC licensed editions in outside the English-speaking world, but out of a desire to try and coordinate it better with publishers that I have a much less intimate relationship with than I have with my American and my British publishers. I'm going to be slightly changing that for subsequent books, like Pirate Cinema, which is the next one. And we'll keep trying it. I've tried like a whole whack of different licenses on my CC licensed books over the years to try and figure out what works, because that's the whole point here, is to find out what allows me to be moral, in the sense of allowing people to do the kind of copying that I do all day long without calling them pirates, and also to achieve artistic satisfaction and make the kind of art that's intended to be copied, because it's the 21st century and copying is easy and everything that people love will be copied. And if you're not making art that's supposed to be copied, it's not contemporary art. It might be good art, but it's certainly not contemporary. I mean, if you want to lie on a scaffold and paint the ceiling of a cathedral, I'm right there with you, brother, but I want to make contemporary art. And so it has to be copyable. And then, I also want stuff that's financially successful, where the structure of the free ebook is such that it leads to people buying the print and the other licensed editions. So that'll be the future of it.
Have you thought about how to change the model when print really goes out of style?
Well, I don't know if it ever will, because, the future composts the past. It rarely replaces it. I mean, we still have lots of live theater, even though we've had movies for a good long while. But if it turns out that print goes away, the one thing that I know absolutely 100%, I don't know much about what that future will look like, but the one thing I do know is that we're never going to stop people who want free ebooks from taking them if they want them. And so, because copying stuff is easy, this is as hard as copying will ever get. Our grandchildren will marvel at how stupidly hard it was to copy things in 2011. Tell me again, Grandpa, did you really only have 20 gigabytes in your laptop? Why, we have more than that in the dog collar. In that world, we're not going to be able to coerce people who don't want to pay into paying, so we're going to have to convince them to pay. And I think that the start of the pitch for getting people to want to pay is to appear like someone who deserves their money. That is to say, someone who's not a jerk. And so that's kind of step one, is like, don't be a jerk. And being a jerk includes things like calling people thieves when they're doing the stuff that you do all your life. So that's kind of my beginning of my plan. And then the rest of it is to cultivate this marvelous German word, Fingerspitzengefühl. To have the feeling of what might be the opportunity, because, opportunities are weird. No one was sure what the search engine business model would be until Google found it. And Google found it not by imposing a model on it. If you remember, Google ran for many years without a business model. They found it by becoming the best search tool that there was, and then looking very closely at what people did and trying to find the opportunities for making money off of it, not the other way around. And I have the luxury as a writer of having virtually no capital costs. So long as I have a writing implement and time, I can produce books. And that means that I can afford to experiment. I don't have to pay for a publishing office. I don't have to pay for a printing press. I don't have to pay for any of the things that other concerns, as opposed to individuals, have to burden themselves with. So my goal as an individual entrepreneur is to keep my capital costs low, be in the middle of everything interesting anyone does with ebooks, and if the market that I'm currently getting my money from collapses, to try and cultivate a sense of what the next market might be.
There are two questions on literary influences. Cold Figure on Twitter wants to know what kind of books you're reading yourself and what your favorite writers are. And Norbert Hasemeyer wants to know if you've been influenced by the work of William Gibson.
Yeah, well, so I read lots. I mean, I was one of those book a day kids, as I'm sure lots of you were, and so I when I finally got rid of my storage locker in Toronto 10 years after leaving the city, it had like a good 10,000 books in it that I gave away. So it's hard for me to kind of sum up a few influences. There are a couple of writers that stand out as writers who I will drop everything to read. William Gibson being one of them, and Bruce Sterling another, but also writers like Kathy Koja. And one of my all-time favorite writers, a man named Daniel Pinkwater, who's probably the funniest writer that ever wrote science fiction of any description, along with very talented nonfiction writers. There's a feature nonfiction writer named Steve Silberman, who used to write a lot of features for Wired and now does it freelance, who's amazing. And again, I would kind of make room for him any day. Or another writer named James Glick, who had a book out this year called The Information, A History, A Theory, A Flood, which is the best book about information theory I've ever read, and just completely blew my mind. As to, is William Gibson an influence? Oh, absolutely. I mean, I grew up reading his stuff. I'm lucky enough to count him as a friend. He's an amazing writer. His stuff just keeps getting better, too. I love that he had the guts to write a science fiction novel set 2 years before it was published. I mean, it's brilliant.
Maybe back to For the Win. Buchbegegnung wants to know if you play online games yourself, what you like about it, and what games you play in case you do.
Well, not so much anymore. I did a whole ton while I was researching For the Win. I played a lot of WoW, and I played a lot of Eve, and I played a lot of, a moderate amount of Second Life, and I dabbled in many others, including a little Lineage and so on, just to try and get the full look at all of them. But as I said before, my wife is the gamer in the house. We have several, stacked up SCART switchers so that we can accommodate all the different consoles under our TV. Whenever we just had the living room painted, and getting the wiring back together was like a major multi-day project that I had to leave exclusively to my wife, because she's the only one who understands how it all works, apart from my 3-year-old daughter, who's actually quite good at figuring out how to get the DVD player back on when she wants to stick one of her DVDs in. So, she's the one. And as to game, I find myself more interested in watching games than playing them these days. And the game that I really love to watch is Left 4 Dead. Left 4 Dead is probably the funnest game to watch I've ever seen, and it's because I think there are two really interesting AI subsystems in it. One of them is an AI subsystem that waits for a moment at which you are almost certain to lose, where you've run out of ammunition, the zombies are rolling over the hills, and it's the most desperate that it can possibly. At that moment, it radically increases the chance of you finding a really good gun. So there's this thing that happens over and over again in Left 4 Dead, where you're like, oh my god, it's all over it. No, it's not! And then it does this other amazing thing. It's a network play game. I think my wife plays it on Xbox, but it runs on lots of different platforms. Each player, you're sitting in different rooms in different parts of the world. Each player has a different soundtrack in their headphones or on their screen, and that soundtrack reflects what's happening in that character's life. So it actually assembles the soundtrack on the fly and kind of makes the music more tense. If you personally are having something bad happen to you, the music gets more tense for you personally. It's a really cinematic game. It's really quite amazing. And there's a little expansion pack, Left 4 Dead 2, that has lots of semi-comedic weapons. Like you can go and kill zombies with an enormous frying pan, which is enormously satisfying, I have to say.
So maybe let's go back to the audience here in the Gartenhaus, which is really packed. Any questions?
Yeah.
Do you know the work or thoughts of Jane McGonigal? Do you agree that, or do you think that games are the model for our future society?
So the question is, do I know the work of Jane McGonigal, who wrote the very good book Reality is Broken? She's a friend of my wife's and a friend of mine. She's a lovely person, and she's one of the great theorists of gamification, the idea of using game-like mechanics to change the way that people work together and to make the world a better place. And I love what Jane has to say. I find that the gamification thus far has required a really high ratio of developers to players. So you end up with these giant, sort of 100 players being motivated to play a game that like 10 people are working on around the clock, which is very cool, but it's not very scalable. I don't know how you'd scale that up to 1 million players. the other thing that I found with many of the big kind of alternate reality gamification projects is that they have the cost structure of a feature film and the audience of a novel. And that's kind of like a disaster, a recipe for going bankrupt. Now, lots of things when they start are very expensive until you figure out how to systematize them and make them cheaper. And I'm waiting for that, because if there's one thing we know about gamification is that it prompts this very, very deep engagement, both with the game, but also with your fellow players. And Jane's idea that you can adapt gamification to be part of your everyday life, to make boring tasks fun, to make dull things interesting, to make things that make the world a better place into things that are also compelling as a game. I love. Thus far, unfortunately, I think the most successful gamification exercises in terms of cost and performance have been things like Farmville, where you take game-like mechanics and you use them to make tasks that are boring, not less boring, but more compelling. So, you play them for 18 hours and you go, oh my God, I feel empty and dead inside, but I'd like to go on and do some more. And I think that the ability to do this, which I think is really about kind of separating what neurologists call hedonic reward from limbic reward. So limbic reward is like the thing your body does when you give it something it needs. That feeling of satisfaction when you put like really full fat milk or cheese on your tongue. That's a limbic reward. Now the hedonic reward is the taste. It's the feeling of hanging out with your friends, eating good cheese. It's the partying. It's the having fun. And when you can provide limbic reward without hedonic reward, you end up in this situation where you're not having any fun and your body wants more of it. And anyone who's kind of gone, oh my God, these chocolates are disgusting, give me another one, has been in a position of limbic reward without hedonic reward. And I really think that a lot of game mechanics as used to date and as envisioned by commercial concerns that are very excited about them are all about tapping into limbic reward while giving as little hedonic reward as they can get away with.
Maybe in that vein, there's a question related to the games by Web8970. Which do you consider more dangerous? Games that simulate everyday life, such as Sims, or games with a fantasy setting, such as World of Warcraft?
Yeah, I don't think of either of those as dangerous particularly. I mean, I think that, everyone knows the story of the one guy or the three people who kind of left their baby in a closet to starve to death while they played Warcraft or whatever. But, I knew a guy who worked as an addiction counselor on high Arctic indigenous communities in Canada, and one of his clients was someone who left their baby in a closet while they played bingo. So my question to you is, what's more dangerous, bingo or Settlers of Catan? I mean, people can do compulsive things in relation to games, but I've yet to see any evidence that the moral panic about the deadly impact of playing games is anything but just a moral panic. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of a perfect storm, right? Because you have a world increasingly in which being young is itself a crime. In the UK, we've established curfews for people under 18. So even if you're not committing any crime, the police can tell you to go home if you're in virtually any major English town center. We've invented this thing called the mosquito that produces a high-pitched tone that only young ears can hear, and they play it in public places to stop young people from congregating. And then when we don't hate children and try to make them leave, we fear for them and try to make them leave. We say, pedophiles are going to come and attack you. Go and shut yourself in your bedroom. And as soon as they get in their bedroom and they yearn for kind of a modicum of human contact over a network, we go, oh my God, you're destroying your life with Facebook and video games. And, it really feels, Heinlein used to have this joking advice that the way that you raise a boy is you put them in a barrel until they're 17, and then when they're 17 you have a conversation with them through the little hole in the barrel, and if you don't like the outcome you put the cork in. And this really seems like the child rearing advice that we've arrived at today. So I mean, we've had moral panics about media that young people use for a long time. There's a guy named Tom Standage who's the technology editor at The Economist, but writes for the Wired sometimes. And he wrote a great piece on the history of moral panics, and he traced them back to the waltz. So the waltz evinced this, and na 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 na. They thought that young people would go crazy if they waltzed, right? And then after the waltz, it was novels. Young ladies would have their blood heated by novels, and then of course the foxtrot, jazz, rock and roll, comic books, movies, television. I mean, there really isn't a popular medium that hasn't been characterized as a kind of danger to people in society. And I think the reason for that is that if you have a big enough sample, there will always be someone who has a pathological relationship with something. And especially when things start out and we're trying to figure out how to incorporate them into our lives, they can be very disruptive. And so, if you spread around enough, Haribo candies, you will eventually find someone who has a pathological relationship to Haribo candies and needs to be airlifted out of their house by 3, army helicopters because they've eaten so many of them. This isn't an indictment of Haribo. It is rather evidence that human beings exist on a bell curve spectrum that has way over on the right hand side of kind of odd occurrences, people who have pathological reactions to all sorts of things. And I really, it's funny because this seems to be, no offense, a recurring theme in my German tour. Which games are more dangerous? Aren't games dangerous? How dangerous are games? Would you let your child play a game? Aren't games bad for you? And I don't know, has it just been what's the equivalent of News of the World here? The tabloid paper?
Bildzeit?
Has Bildzeit just been hammering on this around the clock for the last 3 years? How is it that a nation of people whose reputation is for being incredibly sensible have arrived at the conclusions that video games are going to destroy their society? I don't know.
Maybe,
no offense.
Yeah, maybe people can give short answers in 140 characters on Twitter.
Right. I'll confine my answer to 140 characters.
I try to accommodate everyone. We have 2 on books. One, what is your most precious book? And the other one is also, again, about the future of book publishing. And the question is, will books be like games in the future? Asks Aquatica34.
So my most precious book is not a question I'm very good at answering. If I were a one favorite thing kind of guy, I'd be someone who wrote one blog post and I'd be done. The fact that I've written tens of thousands of them tells you that I'm not a good person for favorites. So there are lots of books that I've read lots and lots of times. I'm trying to think of no, you know what? There just aren't any favorites. I have hundreds and hundreds of favorites. So I just can't answer that. Will books be like games? Well, I think that every new medium that comes along, when the screen came along, it didn't replace the stage, but what it did was it took everything that we'd been doing on a stage that was better suited to a screen, and those things left the stage and moved to the big screen. But we only had one screen. We didn't have television yet. So when television came along, all the stories that we'd been shoving onto the big screen that really belonged in the little screen, we took them off the big screen. We put them on the little screen. And YouTube came along. We took all those stories that were YouTube-like. They weren't 22 minutes long, and they didn't have to be high-res and high production values. And we pulled them out of TV. And then at every turn, you've also had stories or works that had been lurking in potentia, but that hadn't been realizable because there was no way you could put them on a big screen. There are things on YouTube that would never work on a television, things that you can do in movies that you could never, ever do on a stage. And I think that the virtues of each of those things, the virtues of each new medium, aren't the virtues of the old medium, but more so. In fact, usually the thing that the new thing is good at is everything that the old thing was bad at. And the thing that the new thing is bad at is everything the old thing was good at. So everything great about a YouTube video is its immediacy, its intimacy, its availability at any time, night or day, its interactivity, its interlinkedness, all of those things. What's not great about most YouTube videos? The production values, the imprimatur of a major broadcaster that tells you in advance that it's worth watching. All of those virtues that accrue to television are missing from YouTube, and they're not what makes YouTube great. So will ebooks be game-like? No, ebooks will be ebook-like. And I haven't seen an ebook yet that I thought was a good book that wouldn't work as well in print. And so all those things are printed books in electronic form. If there's a sui generis ebook lurking in potentia out there, I haven't read it yet. And I've seen lots of interactive experiments, but none of them that actually sort of leapt off the screen and said, this is what an ebook is meant to be. This is something that is not just a stage play on a silver screen. This is something that's a movie.
Young Ladies Primer.
Young Lady's Primer, yeah, the Neil Stephenson notional ebook from the Diamond Age, the Hugo-winning Neil Stephenson novel.
Yes, several people are, of course, interested in your future book projects. If after 2 young adult novels, are there any plans for sort of an adult science fiction novel?
Yeah. So Charlie Strauss and I just finished a book together called The Rapture of the Nerds. We'd published 2 novellas together before called Appeals Court and Jury Service and Appeals Court, and we've written a third called Parole Board. And they're going to be smushed together with a rewrite to make one book from Tor Books. It will be CC licensed. I've also turned in another young adult novel called Pirate Cinema. That's a book about kids in the UK who make movies by cutting together other movies, and as a result of this, destroy their families, because we have this law in the UK that says that if you download, we take away your family's internet access. That's really a law in the UK, as it is in France and New Zealand, and as they're trying to put through all of Europe. And because this is the near future where everything you do comes through the internet, your job, your education, your health, and so on, they destroy their families. So they run away to London and they form a youth gang devoted to destroying the entertainment industry before the entertainment industry can destroy British democracy. And they do this by making movies and showing them in cemeteries and in sewers and all over. And Heine has bought the German edition, so it'll be coming out in German as well as in English. I don't know if it'll come simultaneously or a little later. It'd be great if it could be simultaneous. I'm working on the sequel to Little Brother right now, and that's called Homeland. I'm hoping to have it done by Christmas, but it won't be out, I think, until 2013. And then the book after that, which I'm looking for the right collaborator for, I hope will be a graphic novel nonfiction about copyright.
Another related question to the writing process, Young Hartnett asks, at Doctoral, how do you keep your story ideas and characters sorted or organized and yourself motivated for writing?
So I think the trick to writing is to not have to be motivated to do it. And that was like my major kind of breakthrough. So all the time when I was writing as a young writer, the one thing that every writer that I spoke to said is, you really must write every day. It's really good if you write every day. And I always thought that they were like, it's like one of those things like you really must get an hour of aerobic exercise every day, or you really must drink 8 glasses of water every day. And I thought it was one of those things that like, if the universe were perfect, you would do this, not like anyone expects you to do it. But when I was working for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, traveling so much that I stopped plugging in my refrigerator, 31 countries in 3 years, I realized that I could only write if I could write when I didn't feel like writing. Otherwise, I'd never write. And so I had to learn to write whenever there was a moment. And so what I decided was I was going to pick a word target. It would be as little as 75 words a day. Mostly it was 250 words a day. And I would hit that target every day, regardless. I'd have a full day to think about it. I'd have a full day to think about what that page would be, because 250 words is one typed page. And it would only take, once I'd thought of it, 10, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. And there are certain tricks that I did to kind of keep myself going. So I always finish in the middle of a sentence so that I know what the first 2 or 3 words will be before when I sit down without having to be creative. And by the time you've written 2 or 3 words, you can write some more. So I kind of said to myself, I could be one of those writers who only writes when inspiration strikes them, but and I know some writers like that, and they're very good writers, but they're not happy writers. And I thought, I've never heard of a garbage man who got garbage man's block. I've never heard of a surgeon who got surgeon's block. I'm sorry, your gallbladder is staying in today, sir. I'm not feeling it. So what I figured is if it's going to be your job, you have to do it when you don't feel like it. And the other thing I realized, having done a couple of books by that point, is I looked back on them and I realized that there was stuff that I'd written where I felt like I'd been like touched by an angel and I was just writing the best work of my life. And there was stuff that I'd written where I felt like every word was being dragged out of my fingertips with fish hooks. And I couldn't tell the difference 6 months later. That the feeling I got while I was writing had almost no relationship to the words and almost everything to do with how I felt about my life at that moment. And so, armed with that realization, I was able to just sit down and put my bum in the chair and just write every day. And the amazing thing about writing every day is that anything you do every day becomes nearly automatic. It just starts to happen. And that's what's happened, is that writing every day has begotten writing every day. So I'm working on the sequel to Little Brother. I'm writing 5 days a week. I changed it from 7 days a week when my daughter was born because I decided I wouldn't work weekends, which I figure surgeons and garbage men also don't do. I'm writing 2,000 words every day, and I've hit 2,000 words every day since I started writing it. I haven't missed a day yet. So, including on this tour. So, I think that's like really, it's like it's one of those simple secrets that everyone tells you and no one believes, which is just write every day. What was the other question? It was how do I keep story ideas and characters sorted and organized? I have a little treatment, a little kind of 3-page what's gonna happen, kind of a bullet formy thing. And then I use a lot of find. If I can't remember what a minor character was called, I use Control F. It's the beauty of having digital works. And then I let people figure it out later. My editor tells me, this character's name changed halfway through, and then we solve it later. I use a text editor. I just use Gedit, which is the default vanilla text editor that comes with Ubuntu. I figure, the people who do the most important typing, who have the choice of any tool that they could type with, who, if they didn't like the tool that they had, could make any tool they wanted, are programmers. And I've never met a programmer who writes software in Word. And so I figure if you're going to use the world's most industrial strength text generation and management tool, you should just use the tools programmers do. And they use text editors. What I do for version control is I use version control. I use Git, which is the thing that programmers use to run, the Linux kernel and so on. And it's just a thing that tracks all the changes to a file over time. So every 15 minutes, my computer has a script that runs and says, have any of the files that I'm working on changed? And if they have, it takes those changes and records them. And then it just because it can, it records the last 3 songs I've listened to, the last 3 things I put on Boing Boing, the weather where I am, the city I'm in, if it can find it from my IP address. And little sprinkles of context. I figure in sort of 20 years I'll go back and discover, I do my best writing in Munich while listening to light jazz. But in the meantime, I figure it's context I can capture, so why shouldn't I?
What about developing the plot? In For the Win, you have 3 or 4 different perspectives, characters, which only get entangled in the course of the novel. And, there are writers who use complicated visual aids and stuff.
I just have these, these bullet point outlines of kind of where I think things are going to head. And then for me, so long as you have a person in a place with a problem that's getting worse, there's always a reason to turn the page. So all you need to do to get from one place that you want to be to the next place you want to be is imagine a problem for the person, imagine a way that she can try and solve it intelligently and fail and have things get worse, and then something else will happen. And eventually things can't get any worse, and that's the climax. And then you're done.
Any further questions from the audience here in the room? None? Then we go back to the people out there. Again, about sort of the dangers of computer games. Nico Noll reports, I've been addicted to World of Warcraft for years and started when I was 13. I never left a baby in a closet, even though I've managed school well and I'm successful at university. I still see the danger in leaving parents and kids uneducated about the dangers of such addicting things. But now the interesting question. What's your sociological opinion on handling games? Are they drugs, sweets, or a piece of classical music?
So I guess I don't know what it means to be addicted to something that doesn't cause you any problems. That to me just sounds like something that you find incredibly engaging. So for me that... you would say that I was addicted to writing novels, or addicted to blogging, or addicted to having brunch every Sunday at our favorite brunch restaurant, or addicted to swimming. None of these are things that I think of as addiction. I don't understand what the pathology is of the scenario that you've just described. If you describe a situation in which you do something a lot, because you enjoy it and it satisfies you, and it hasn't negatively impacted your life, I don't know how that constitutes a danger. To me, that just constitutes a thing, a life, you know. So I think what I would say is that especially when you're young, it is the nature of being young to be enthusiastic and to find things that compel your attention, and that one of the best ways that I know of to learn is to find things that engross all of your attention, and then go as deep and as thoroughly into them as you can, because you'll find out all kinds of interesting and wonderful things. Maybe it's because I went to fairly non-traditional education, but I went to a public alternative school where you had a very self-directed program. And so, 1 year I found math really interesting. I was about 10, and my teachers didn't say, stop doing math and start doing history now, or your development will be uneven. They said, for so long as you're this interested in math, keep reading math. I mean, you're going to have to learn history and everything else before you graduate, but if math is it this year, do math, kid. It's math time. Your brain is telling you it's math time. Here's some more math books. Go crazy. I only hope that I can find things that my daughter is incredibly interested in, that are complicated and interesting and have lots of other dimensions to them. And if I found her playing a lot of WoW, like my wife does, I mean, I'm a WoW widower. My goal would be to find ways to make WoW relevant to all the other things that she needs to know to be a complete person, like to play WoW with people in foreign countries, and to play WoW in ways that kind of make her question the management structure of WoW, and to play WoW in ways that make her think about how to run a guild, and how to be a good guild player, and how to be a good guild manager, and how to hold a guild together and break it apart. All these things that are kind of lessons that apply to your whole life. I just hope that she would learn them.
Another question pertaining to your activism. Hatash asks, civil rights in cyberspace times is a topic in the US since decades. What people did you meet there? How did they influence you? So how did your activism for that come about?
I started off because I'd started a software company, a peer-to-peer software company with two friends in Toronto. We raised a lot of venture capital, and I moved to San Francisco to open our office there. Our venture capitalists started to get worried around the time Napster started to get sued, and I found myself talking a lot to people from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. A lot of our programmers came from a hacker group called Cult of the Dead Cow, and they'd worked with the Electronic Frontier Foundation during the fight over legalizing cryptography. And so I became good friends with them. I gave them office space. We had a little extra office space in San Francisco, and they lost their lease, and they needed a temporary spot. And when our investors got so nervous about the company that they took it away from us because of all the lawsuits over peer-to-peer, I found myself working for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I met some of the most interesting people of my life. They were lawyers and musicians and artists and activists and programmers and crypto warriors and millionaires and paupers and anthropologists and sociologists. I'm not sure how to answer that question apart from, interesting people of eclectic background such as you would find on a San Francisco street.
Yeah, I mean, we're all back and forth here, but I guess that's the way life is. So you have to put on your author hat again. Sarah Gottwald wants to know, do you have the ambition to write a book in another genre as the books you already wrote? So will you be a science fiction guy?
Well, yeah. Forever? I mean, I've written a fantasy novel. I wrote a novel called Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. That's a book about a guy whose father is a mountain, his mother is a washing machine, his brothers nest like Russian dolls, and he leaves his town in northern Ontario, moves to Toronto to start an open wireless network. It's a kind of an absurdist fantasy novel, but it's definitely fantasy. It's not science fiction. I've written plenty of nonfiction. I'm writing this graphic novel next. I find science fiction to be an inherently satisfying literature of the 21st century. People keep saying, aren't you worried the present will catch up with you? And, I can't imagine a better time to be writing science fiction than a time in which the present is catching up with you. I mean, what a great time to write books about the way that technology interacts with our society. What time have we ever needed narratives to help us have a vocabulary to describe these inchoate, novel effects that technology is giving rise to in our relationships with each other, our governments, our children, our families. I mean, this is the best time in the history of the world to be a science fiction writer.
Any more questions?
How are we doing?
Bitte.
Yeah.
Please.
Just again to the activism part. What do you think about the movement? We have a big movement, many organizations. Just what do you mean? What do you think are the main organizations here in Europe? So I mean, I know.
You mean like Quadrature de Net and CCC and Netzpolitik and so on?
And where does it move? I mean, it's just always a big fight, and you hear about ACTA and
sure.
And
yeah. Well, I think that what's interesting in the last couple of months is the way that hacker movements, so like the proper Hackspace kind of thing, whether that's Seabase or London Hackspace or Noisebridge, are finding common cause first with the Arab Spring and now with the Occupy movement and finding themselves politicized, and then the more kind of anarchic, nihilistic side, the anonymous 4chan stuff, are also finding common cause there. And at the same time, all the people who weren't geeks, but who now feel like technology is critical to both Occupy and understanding and unraveling the debt crisis, and also what happened in the Middle East and what still is happening in the Middle East, that there is finally this moment where we're starting to recognize that this isn't about copyright, it's about the internet, because you can't say to YouTube, well, I demand that a lawyer review all the material that goes on YouTube before it goes live, because there aren't enough lawyers, like there never will be enough lawyers. All the lawyers working in concert until the heat death of the universe couldn't go through all of YouTube's videos. And as soon as you say to them you have to do that, well, the only way they can accomplish that is by charging people to have a lawyer look at their work before it goes live. And that means that you'll never get a Syrian dissident putting their video up, because not only can't they afford to put their video up, there's no way to send money from your Syrian dissident satellite uplink to Google to pay for the lawyer to make sure that your video of a human rights atrocity is reported in real time. So this is people are starting to realize that if you make a copyright policy, you make an internet policy, but they're also starting to realize that there's no internet policy anymore. There's just policy, because everything we do in the real world today involves the internet, and everything we'll do in the real world tomorrow will require it. So, there's this borough in London, Hounslow, where to save money because of the debt crisis, they've shut down all payment systems that involve going to a window and giving them money for something. So if you want to build a shed on the side of your house and you need a permit, you can only pay for that over the internet. If you got a parking ticket, you can only pay for it over the internet. If you need to pay a fee to register your baby, you can only do it over the internet. So this is the beginning, right? Because austerity isn't unique to the UK. Austerity is everywhere, and it's going to get worse. And it's going to be worse here, and it's going to be worse everywhere that people live. And we're going to find this brutal elimination of anything even remotely inefficient in favor of the internet. And so as soon as you say to people, as we are with these 3 strikes rules, if you're accused. If you live with someone who's accused of breaking copyright, we're going to take away your internet access. What we're really saying is we're going to give you the internet death penalty. We're going to give you the information society death penalty. We're going to take away your ability to register your baby. And this is an enormous seismic thing to happen to the world. And now that you have this confluence of Occupy, of Anon, of Hackspace green technology moving to Occupy locations, of the Arab Spring and so on, people are starting to get it. I actually have some hope for it. I also like the way that we now have a spectrum of activity. In the old days when we had EFF and no one else really, people would go, oh, those people from EFF, they're crazy anarchists who want to eliminate copyright. And then we can say, no, you're thinking of Anonymous. We're very sober. No mask. And it's great because it's lovely to have someone who makes you look reasonable somewhere in the room.
Yeah, we're still here with Cory Doctorow on the Lovely Books live stream reading. It's been fantastic, and hour that's been flying by like it was 10 minutes. Thanks to you, Cory, for so expertly answering all these questions in no time. Thanks everybody here in the room, and thank you out there for all of your questions, and sorry if we didn't get to answer every question. That's it from my side.
All right.
Good evening.
Wiedersehen. Thanks.